All right, this is it. Episode 2, Billy. Episode 2.
Yes, that's tight, yo. I love it. Listen, we've been episode 2, and we've been working on switching back and forth with the intro music. So episode 1 was my approach to the music on the intro, and then Jesse crushed it with that, and I think we're just gonna keep that going, man. See what we
Keep
come
that
up
energy.
with. Yeah.
All right. What do we do today? You know, we decided episode 2. Let's just jump right into class war.
Why not? Why not?
Why not?
Makes sense.
It's everybody's doing it. Let's do it. Or at least the government's doing it. So let's figure it out. I feel like COVID is one of the things it's doing for those of us who are in isolation, and maybe everybody, is provoking a lot of reflection. It's also, you know, in passing, Ramadan Kareem to all our Muslim friends out there, which is the month of reflection and trying to be empathetic to the poor and people like this. But we can get into that later, because I know you've got something about trying to put yourself in the shoes of other people later.
Absolutely.
And so we'll be talking about that for sure. But I think a lot of people right now are being forced to reflect on who are these characters in their lives that we call landlords, for those who are renters, or banks for those who are having to pay mortgage payments. I think for almost everybody right now, those people are still saying, you know what, you got to pay like it was like nothing's happening. You know, it's I know the news is telling you that things are different, everything's changed, but not when it comes to these payments. And so we're going to jump into a bit of that and ask ourselves whether or not on May 1st of this month, people should be paying rent.
We're talking about putting rent and living expenses in the context of a global crisis, and what that means, what that should mean for everyone. Everyone's adjusting. Everyone's trying to figure it out. The government's taking steps to secure the economy as they define it, the ways that they do it. And is that the only way to go about things, and what can we do?
Yeah, and by April 19th of this month in the US, 11% of renters had not yet paid their April rent. So that's about 6% more than typically for a regular month, it seems, according to the Landlords councils. I've been spending a lot of time in the world of the landlords researching for this episode.
Nice.
It's not the most exciting world, but we'll get into that in a bit. It's like it's not. I wouldn't want to read like a novel written by, or an autobiography of a landlord, or like it's pretty boring.
I've got to see these clips, man. I've got to see what you. I mean, I'm so excited. I haven't seen some of this yet.
Well, before we get into that,
Okay.
I mean, there's people out here who are calling for I just want to put this in the context. There's people out here calling for a rent strike, which is a blunt object, where you just refuse to pay rent. And this strike it has like an ethical component. So even for people who might not be, you know, at the verge of homelessness if they had to pay their rent, but other people saying, you know, like, in this situation where the government's pumping trillions of dollars into corporations and stuff like that, is it really ethical for me to deplete my little savings I have just to pay you some rent, when your livelihood's not really on the line for a lot of landlords, you know? And so so people are saying that. And then also, you know, the concept of a strike is you're withholding something that you do have. So typically it's your labor, right? You're saying, like, I'm not going to give you my work like I usually do. And in this situation, it would be withholding your rent in solidarity with those who can't pay it. So you become a bigger group, and you become harder to evict, harder to make moves on, harder to pressure, the bigger you get. And so a lot of people are trying to figure out what that would look like in their building. For example, you know, like, what percentage of my building do I have to get on board to do this? And it seems like, you know, you probably need a good percentage, because this is risky stuff. I mean, if you go on your own and say, yeah, landlord, I'm not paying rent, I'm part of the rent strike movement, but you're the only one in your building that's part of that movement, they have a very simple recourse for that.
Yeah.
And you will not be in that building for too long, probably.
For sure. And the strength really is in numbers. And the challenge is with the landlords, it's quite easy for them, the leverage and the power that they hold in the legal system. And of course, in many cities, like in New York, I know there's a stoppage, a suspension of all, extracting people from their homes, evicting people is the word I was looking for.
Yeah, extracting. No, I like that. It felt like The Sims, like you're, they remember the Sims, just like pull, just like, I know, well, I haven't played probably 20 years, right? But it's like you just remove people from the home. I'm going to put you outside,
Yeah,
just like drop you outside.
An eviction, yeah. So there's I think a lot of states are instituting a 3-month suspension on evictions, but those bills will continue to grow, and they are still going to come due after 3 months, and so these measures,
that means nothing.
It doesn't.
That
these
means
measures
nothing.
Are half measures.
That just means you're going to have debt.
Exactly.
It means you're just going to have debt.
Exactly.
So speaking of financial difficulties, I spent an absurd amount of time listening to Landlord podcasts. And
thank you, Jesse, doing it so that we don't have to.
I did this for you guys. I'm not gonna lie, I got into it at some point, and I found a favorite Landlord podcast, and this is what it sounds like.
I can't believe it.
Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast.
What did you do? Did you reach out to people to see if they were going to be okay, or did you just wait for the first to come around?
I don't go out and call my tenants and say, hey, are you going to be able to pay me rent this month?
Right.
Because of all this going on. That's kicking the hornet's nest.
Like, you don't want to maybe open the door to making it okay to not pay rent.
Because I don't want to kick anybody out.
Yeah.
And I doubt any landlord out there wants to kick anybody out.
Sure.
Especially if they're good tenants.
Yeah.
Things like this happens in life, It's Murphy's Law.
Yep.
And it unfortunately happens to tenants.
So
unfortunately happens to tenants,
yeah, it's happening to them.
Yeah.
It's like this unfortunate thing is happening to them. And I would say I picked this one to start with first. There's better ones to come, because I feel like this one was pretty representative of what I was hearing on these podcasts, which was, this feeling of constant repeating of, nobody wants to kick anybody out. This is really not what we want to do. This is nobody's fault, but it's inevitable that if they don't pay the rent, we got to kick them out. I mean, that's just how it's got to work.
How it works. That's what.
And there's never anywhere in any of these podcasts any questioning of that.
Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords.
Right now, I'm stuck at about 25% of people not having paid. For me, that's about it's well north of 10 grand, and it's such that I actually can't cover all the mortgage obligations right now.
Wow, that's horrible. So you just have to kind of dip into your rainy day fund and keep the mortgages going. Are you stressing out? Like, I can't imagine what this must feel like. Is it really tough going through this right now?
Yes, I think it is. And I'll watch a TV broadcast and my anxiety level will spike. And then what I have to remember is there's people like Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, and following the dot-com crash way long ago, people said for years that Amazon would never turn a profit. And I think for us as long-term real estate investors and landlords who want this to be the seed of our retirement and future abundance, we have to remember this is just a cycle and we'll get through it. We need to stay strong and remember that there are better times to come.
That's Fleming Schutrum. He's been with us twice before. He talked about how he retired off his rental income at age 41.
So wait, that was the dude who was saying everything prior. He was this poor, sullen man, shell of a man who retired at 41.
Yeah. So and it's just, that must be horrible.
Yeah.
Like the host is, that must be horrible. I can't imagine what you're going through.
That's crazy. Yeah.
And
it's obvious that you can extend the same logic, the same empathy, just extend it a little bit further, and it would make even more sense to apply that to the renter as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And last week we talked about Viktor Frankl and and suffering. And one of the things I didn't get to that Viktor Frankl talks about as somebody who survived the Nazi death camps and the Holocaust is that he uses a gas metaphor to talk about suffering, which is that human suffering is like a gas and it fills the space. So like in this case, the suffering of these landlords in this situation is like, it has to do with the future that they've imagined for themselves. So they've projected themselves out into the future, and I don't know where they have themselves, if it's on living on their own island or hanging out with Jeff Bezos or whatever they have in the future. And then that's what's under threat right now. So it's not, whereas like for the renter, it's like an immediate physical challenge of like, where am I going to live? How am I going to get food? Whatever it might be. Their suffering has to do with this future thing that is now in jeopardy and maybe might not happen.
Powerfully put. I think that's right. And I think obviously that podcast is geared towards that. It's a group hug kind of thing. It's for those groups. I know there's probably another podcast out there about the price of boat maintenance and how that's difficult at this point,
Totally.
And they have that space, and maybe they're entitled to that space. However, I think it's funny. I think it's hilarious to listen to the musings and the sadness. But I think it touches on something else. If I can go to it touches on the concept of the inability to kind of feel the position of the other and understanding that what it means to be in someone else's shoes. And so this brings me to like a broader like philosophical point and conversation around, what a just society looks like, what just situations look like. And it brings me to a guy named John Rawls. And so quick intro on John Rawls. John Rawls was born in Baltimore, and he is an American philosopher, political philosopher. And what he's really known for is this book he wrote in 1971 called A Theory of Justice. And it's an amazing book. I was made familiar with it a couple of years back. And I think we should probably...
It's big, man. When you brought him up, I was like, oh, that sounds like a great book. I love the title. And then I saw the size of it, and I just came up with a whole bunch of reasons why it would just be easier to watch the YouTube video.
Exactly. And you know what? Let's go into a YouTube video.
Imagine if you were not you. Rawls intuitively understood that a lot of the reason why societies don't become fairer is that those who benefit from current injustice are spared the need to think too hard about what it would have been like to be born in different circumstances. So he devised one of the greatest thought experiments in the history of political thought. He called it the veil of ignorance. Rawls asks us to imagine ourselves in a conscious, intelligent state before our own birth, but without any knowledge of what circumstances we're going to be born into. We wouldn't know what sort of parents we'd have, what our neighbourhoods would be like, and how the police and judicial systems might treat us, and so on. The question that Rawls asks us all to contemplate is, if we knew nothing about where we'd end up, what sort of a society would it feel safe to enter? The veil of ignorance draws our attention to the appalling risks involved in entering, for example, US society as if it were a lottery, without knowing if you'd wind up the child of an orthodontist in Scottsdale, Arizona, or as the offspring of a black single mother in the rougher bits of eastern Detroit. Any sane participant of the veil of ignorance experiment is going to want a society with a number of things in place. They'll want the schools to be very good, the hospitals to function brilliantly, unimpeachable and fair access to the law, and decent housing for everyone.
Yeah.
And
shout out to the School of Life. First of all, this is another. We had a clip in the first episode from the School of Life, and this is another one, and that's a great resource, huh?
Yeah, it is a great resource. And I just hit this one like yesterday. I was like, oh, this is great. What makes the whole, it's a philosophical, theoretical thought experiment. What makes it interesting is that it allows you to, like, in any situation, kind of strip away your own bias and strip away our own understanding of like gripes and the benefits and harms in our current present society that won't allow us to see certain situations more clearly. I think that's what's strong about it. Yeah. It has its limitations. I think it's theoretical. It's not like super useful in everyday life, but I think it does help with some guidance here. And so, like, on the issue of like being a landlord or a tenant, with the veil of ignorance, if you come in and think about any given situation, like there's a COVID-19 global crisis, there's all kinds of harm and pain and suffering, financial and physical, and all these things. Do you and there's a landlord-tenant system, and rent is due. The question is, do we kick people out of their homes, even 3 months from now, right? 3 months from now, you say, oh, don't do it for 3 months. 3 months, 4 months, 5 months from now, the veil of ignorance says you don't know if you're a landlord or a tenant. You come at this question uncertain. Are you the guy that we just heard, Jesse, the guy who's retired and is concerned about like this vision of his future?
Fleming Shoe Trump. His name's Fleming Shoe Trump.
Exactly.
I'm sure it's Fleming Shoe Trump the third. I'm sure.
Did you say the third?
Sorry.
No,
I don't know. I don't know.
Are you that guy, or are you like the rest of us? Mm-hmm. And if you don't know, like you come in and you have to create systems that would give you freedom and also protect you, put you in a position that is not the worst off, that is not evicted and on the street. So it's helpful, but there's other things involved to carry.
Yeah, and I think it's a good moment to just mention that like it's a major weakness of the English language, and I think other languages too. I know in French it's the same in Spanish, but that you have one word for landlord when you're talking about like a lot of different realities, right? So, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're saying might not apply, in specific situations. For example, like if you're living in the basement of like a retired person who's living off of a meager pension, and the rent that you pay them is what allows them, them to keep paying their mortgage payments or whatever, and keep living in their primary home, then this is not really what we're talking about, right? Like, and I just thought I would take the opportunity to throw it out. But also, I mean, like, to be honest, I was a little shocked that this thought experiment was new in 1971. Like, it seems like something that humans would have come up with a lot earlier. But then I think in that same video, they mentioned later that he was really inspired by the Apollo mission and the images that came back of seeing the Earth. And I had heard this talked about before, like, oh, that changed the world. And, as somebody born in 1985, it was like, yeah, sure, I guess that makes sense. It changed the world to be able to see the world for the first time. But but then this seems like a concrete example of like, that thought experiment hadn't been written down before. Is shocking.
Yeah, it may have been written down before. Obviously, this dude, he.
But he's famous for it. He's famous for it.
Exactly, he's the one. But what's crazy about it? Let's a little bit about John Rawls. I didn't even mention this, which is nuts. He's 7 years old, right? What year is this? I had it written down here. 7 years old. He contracts 1928. Okay, he contracts diphtheria. Okay. Which is
I can't even, that sounds bad. I can't remember what it is, but it sounds bad.
Yeah, look that up. It's like so 7 years old, his brother Bobby visits him, and Bobby contracts the disease and dies. John Rawls survives. The next year, contracts pneumonia. Another brother, Tommy, visits him, contracts pneumonia from John Rawls, dies.
What?
John Rawls survives. Yes. And so
double survivor's guilt?
Double survivor's guilt, yeah.
Wow.
Essentially killed two
plus
of
transmission
his brothers.
plus transmission guilt? He's got like survivor's guilt and transmission guilt times 2.
It's crazy.
Damn.
It's crazy. So this is a man who had to live with that and consider the implications of fairness and randomness. He's dealing with contract theory, and it's in that branch essentially, and he's done it in a way that's really
What's that? What's contract theory?
Contract theory is a branch of like political philosophy that is kind of it's obsessed or not obsessed. It's focused on the question of how and why we care for each other, what kinds of societies we can build, what are our responsibilities and duties to each other.
Oh, like the social contract, like
the social contract. Yes.
Okay. Cool.
So you're completely a neighbor, and we don't know each other, but we're both humans. We're both breathing the same air. We're both sitting on similar plots of land next to bodies of water. What does that mean? And how do we deal with each other. And so this is just one of those. And so that's kind of, it rests on those shoulders. It's pretty, I think, find it pretty dope.
That's cool. I mean, I think it's interesting that we're recording this during Ramadan, which is, which goes almost a step further in the sense of this isn't a thought experiment. It's like you're asked for 1 month a year as a Muslim to fast for a month, during the day, no water, no food. And it has like a couple functions as my understanding of it is. And, one of them is to allow you to really build an empathy with the poor and to really build an empathy with people who don't have food, to actually know. So not just to imagine what it might be like, in the example of the video, to be a single mother in East Detroit, but like to actually feel what it feels like to have hunger in your belly for a month,
Wow.
And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then and another side of that is that it's supposed to develop a gratefulness too, so that you moving forward you become very grateful, which is just a better outlook on life. And most of the people that I like to hang out with are people that I see that outlook. They tend to be grateful for what they have. And they count their blessings.
Same.
They count their blessings.
Same. You mentioned Islam. There's a concept in Judaism called the Jubilee, or it has its origins there, and since then it's been all over the place. Every 49 years, at the end of sabbatical cycle, so 7 times 7, Hebrew slaves and prisoners would be freed, debts would be forgiven, and it says the mercies of God would be particularly manifest. How interesting is that? So it was really focused on large land, property, and property rights. So it's just interesting. It's amazing. Also, jubilees were also like they would coincide quite often with the reign of a new king. A king would take a throne in different parts of the world. He would raise his sacred torch and proclaim a debt amnesty. And the reasons were crazy. It wasn't always just this benevolent thing. It wasn't like they were being nice or utopian. In those times, the economies were very different, obviously. We're dealing with land and cattle and goat and such. And a lot of times people would be in debt to landowners, and if they didn't handle that debt in a certain amount of time, they would fall into perpetual bondage. It would move from being a debtor to being essentially a slave. And so kings would come in and they would see the only way to kind of free those people from that condition, so that they could live well and not like flee the kingdom and run away, was to declare a debt jubilee. And so that's a really interesting concept that has worked.
It has an awareness in it that these systems were like over time get less and less fair. Like there's a growing inequality, and you have to reset the system. Which is, I guess, an opportunity also to change certain things too. When you hit that reset, I'm also just curious about what lending looked like 3 months before the Jubilee.
Exactly.
Like, so
that's the funny.
This is coming. It's like, hey man, can I borrow? Can you spot me 100?
Exactly. That's the funny part, man. And the 49 every 49 years, and that 48th.
Yeah.
You come in and you be like,
crazy year, man. That last year before the Jubilee would be pretty wild.
Exactly.
Trying to get anything done. But I have a couple more Landlord clips. Because I know everybody out there really just wants to hear that intro to the podcast again. So here it is.
Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast.
There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and it's perfectly natural to be scared. But this could also be a huge opportunity. And today on the podcast, I wanted to explore that a little bit. Joining us on the show is an investor that invested and made a lot of money during the last 2 recessions. How long do you think it'll take before there may be opportunities out there?
That might start to play itself out, later on. 3-6 months down the line. I mean, it takes a little bit to actually foreclose on a property. So
yeah, that's true.
You know what I mean?
Oh,
so
man.
So it's pretty clear here that there's a large class of people who just have a lot of capital and wealth sitting around, and who who have a moral system that allows them to just easily and without much like fear of judgment by some god when they arrive in heaven or anything like that, to just slide into like a shark role in a moment like this and just feed, off of the corpses. It's a little too much.
Yeah.
A little too much, but something like that. And so this debt jubilee you're talking about, this reset for me is like is not only to reset the economic system and to reset all these debts and odious situations that people are in, but also a moral reset to be like, whoa, what have we become? Like what's happened to us?
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just, again, this situation didn't start a month ago. The situation of people's debts overtaking their abilities to live, and this debt economy overtaking the real economy. People, paying hundreds and thousands of dollars down on like student loans, not then being able to go out to a restaurant, not being able to do cool things they want to do that would feed the economy in other more meaningful, like useful ways. And so the whole idea of a debt jubilee, Jesse, is back. People are talking about it again. People were always talking about it. People were talking about it back in 2006. I was seeing that on YouTube and these campaigns and efforts. But in 2019, 2020, things have gotten bad that it's out there in the mainstream as a conversation for something to do to like help people right now.
Okay.
And it was like something considered silly, impossible. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, an economist who proposed a debt jubilee in the mainstream, economic conversations couldn't get it done.
And I think, like I said, one of the things that is like most fascinating to me about the concept of a debt jubilee is a resetting of the moral code and allowing us all to see each other again. Because this is something that I feel like these landlords that show up on this podcast, I gotta go back. I got one more clip from this podcast, Billy. I'm saving the best for last, and I really think you're gonna love this one.
Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast.
Asked if I could be flexible with their rent, that they'd lost their job. Because I'm fair, but I'm also firm. I reminded them that, the owners have a mortgage with this property, and it's not going to be forgiven. You're getting a stimulus check. Hopefully you've got some savings or money that you can borrow.
You sent everyone out a gift basket, which I think is a great idea. What was in the gift basket?
Started with a roll of toilet paper with a little sticker on it that said, "I survived the toilet paper crisis of 2020. It had some candy in it, a journal, about 15 thinking of you cards that they could send out to friends and relatives, a pocket knife saying, like a little Swiss Army knife that said Corona 2020. We delivered 350 of them over the weekend, probably 25 texts or emails saying, "Oh my gosh, thank you." So you figure, for every one person that responded positively, there were 10 that would have but didn't. So it was overwhelmingly positive. And it buys a little bit of goodwill. I'd rather spend $35 for a gift basket than have to give a $500 rent concession next month.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So let's remember. What's in the gift basket? Toilet paper. Okay, you've lost your job. You can't pay rent. You get toilet paper, some candy, a journal, I guess, to write down your thoughts, some thinking of you cards, and to top it off, a pocket knife with Corona 2020 written on it. So I'm picturing. Do you remember Unsolved Mysteries? Remember the show Unsolved Mysteries? Like that was the most terrifying program of my childhood, I think, without a doubt. If people haven't seen it, it's worth going to just look how these episodes would start. And it'd have this scary man with a deep voice and he has these deep set eyes, and they would have like a smoke machine behind him, and it would be all dark and scary. And then he would say, you know, in this situation, it would be something like, Frank Skelback of Madison, Wisconsin, was stabbed 832 times with a small pocket knife.
Yeah,
the autopsy showed he had been forcefully fed 4 pounds of jelly beans. He was found in the dumpster of his own rental property, wrapped in toilet paper, like a mummy, with a journal on top which said, May 1st, I survived the toilet paper crisis, but not the gift basket. It's like, this is what I was imagining.
Yes, they constructed the tools for their own demise. Why the knife? I don't get it. Why the toilet paper? It's all like, it's kind of like these little trinkets, this little like tongue in cheek, like, because it's a joke. It's what you said. It's a little bit, they're just so a bit divorced
I think
from
they genuinely thought this was like a great idea. Like,
that's what I'm saying.
You know, when he said, he's like, out of the 350, 25 people wrote me back and said, oh my gosh, this is great. And then he says, which I assume for every one that did, there's 10 that, and I'm thinking, 10 that are like writing down in that journal, like all the different ways they're thinking about, you know, killing you, or you know what I mean? And this is the reset. Like, there needs to be a reset. And that I feel like a debt jubilee is the way to do this reset, because people are not seeing each other. This guy has no empathy whatsoever. How could he possibly think that somebody in the middle of that situation would want to get a pocket knife with Corona 2020 written on it?
Right. As opposed to a real gift, a real act of empathy and understanding and support. So it's a bit of it's a total bait and switch, and like, look over here, I'm being nice.
Totally bait and switch. And they talk about it. I'd much rather give out a $35 gift basket than a $500 rent discount. You know, like
they say it clearly, yo. Thanks for listening to those podcasts on our behalf. That's a technique from way back. Sometimes you watch these, like, listen to what people are saying to themselves, like the targeted things that are for certain groups, and you go, wow, that's how they speak when no one's around, no one's listening. And or at least no one they think that would disagree with the underlying premises. So if you rent strike would be like an instrument, or to get organized, and let's say this is the class of people that you're kind of like you would be pushing the financial burden onto them, right? By saying, I'm not paying my rent. These guys have mortgages, and now they have to figure out how to deal with it. So then they are organized. Like, there's no landlord social movement. Like, they don't march in the streets, right? Like, they have organizations and associations which have the numbers of the mayor or whoever to talk about property taxes. They know they deal directly with banks and figuring out renegotiating their mortgages, all these things. And so they would pass it up another level. So who's up above them? And the banks and the big money, the ones who are getting these trillions of dollars that are going out into the economy right now. And one of these billionaires, named Chamath Palihapitiya, he is, we're actually both from Ottawa. We don't really know each other, but we're the same Jesse, are you trying to claim him as a friend? Is that what's happening?
We're both from Ottawa. We were born in the same year, and he, when he was in high school, he worked at Burger King, and I worked at Taco Bell. Wow. So we were competitors. I like to think of ourselves as competitors.
Yeah.
I like to think of Chamath and I as competitors.
And I think you're winning. Though, Aaron.
Totally. Yeah. But so you mentioned it, like, there's so much to be gained from doing this empathetic thing and saying, okay, what's going on in that world? And Chamath has gone on television in the past month and has very succinctly described some of the things that have been happening in the billionaire world, and criticize it. And so here's a clip of him on CNBC earlier this month.
The CEOs of companies and compensation committees of most boards have been engaged in a game. And this game is all about working compensation around earnings per share. And even when earnings would not naturally go up, they were able to juice earnings per share by reducing share counts. They did that by getting levered and doing buybacks. That enriched CEOs, it enriched board directors, and it enriched the hedge funds that activated for those changes. That's all it helped. And the problem with that is that now we have a whole bunch of companies who, frittered away tens and hundreds of billions of dollars on buybacks when they should have been saving it for a rainy day, investing it in R&D, or doing something that was much more important than what they did. There needs to be consequences for those actions. Not a single person went to jail in 2008 in Wall Street and in that financial mechanism. And in return, what happened was Main Street was decimated, the opioid crisis was created, the wealth gap was exacerbated. You can't go through this again. And we have a responsibility this time around to learn from what we did wrong the last time. You can't just bail folks out financially for being financially greedy. It's unfair. And the American people have a right to demand that you cannot run leverage this way. It's like giving a baby a loaded gun.
Chamath, I'm going to leave it there.
So there's a lot of jargon in there, and but I think the core of it is that he's describing in the terms of his world the connection between the massive increase in inequality and wealth that we've seen since 2008, like exactly how that mechanism worked at their level, at least at the billionaire level, and how it's connected to their need for this massive bailout. So basically, he's talking about how these hedge funds and different banks and things like this got heavily leveraged again, which means that they borrowed a lot of money and they gambled it on risky things, like they did before 2008. And they found new ways of hiding it. And that the CEOs and the boards of directors of these companies got themselves increasingly more wealthy through this game where they tied their compensation or their wage, their income, to something called earnings per share. And then what they did is they would just cut the number of shares by using the profits of the company to buy back the existing shares. So reducing the number of shares, inflating artificially the earnings per share. So they would get massive bonuses and things like this. So that is what made these companies not have a rainy day fund, not be more resilient. And that's something that he talks about a lot. Is like this moment is that maybe we'll talk about in a bit. It's gonna be a shifting away from efficiency towards resiliency.
It speaks to that's only one of a myriad of like financial tools and tricks and things at their disposal at any time. Mm-hmm. At any time in times of like growth and positivity and expansion and benefit. And in times of difficulty, there's always an out or a way out. And when we talk about, I thought it was interesting. You said in terms of resiliency, it feels like in the podcast, the clips that you've been saying, there's this underlying like, well, didn't he say you got checks coming in? And so there's a way of, and they want to do it nicely, but it's a way of like suggesting, hey, are you resilient? Can you muscle through this?
Oh, you're talking about the landlords to the renters.
The landlords, yes,
like
exactly.
Of course you should have a rainy day fund. Of course you should be prepared for this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, of course you're fine with that, right? And so that's the tone there. And then up top, it's a completely different tone, a completely different system.
In another interview with the same host on CNBC, Chamath actually laid out a pretty fascinating critique of what he calls Wall Street's big lie.
Are you arguing to let airlines, for example, fail?
Yes.
Why? I mean, how does that make sense in the broader scheme of the economy?
Because when you look at what it means, this is why I'm saying, like, this is a lie that's been purported by Wall Street. When a company fails, it does not fire their employees. It goes through a packaged bankruptcy, right? If anything, what happens is the people who have the pensions inside those companies, the employees of these companies, end up owning more of the company. The people that get wiped out are the speculators that own the unsecured tranches of debt or the folks that own the equity. And by the way, those are the rules of the game. That's right.
Why does anybody, I just don't understand, why does anybody deserve, using your word, to get wiped out from a crisis created like this? How does anybody deserve to get wiped out?
Well, but just be clear, like, who are we talking about? We're talking about a hedge fund that serves a bunch of billionaire family offices. Who cares? Let them get wiped out. Who cares? They don't get to summer in the Hamptons. Who cares?
I mean, there are people. You don't think the employees? Hold on, Scott. You don't think the employees of these companies own stocks? I mean, own their stocks, own the company's stocks?
You can look on Bloomberg and you can see what percentage of these companies are typically owned by. These things are owned by BlackRock. These things are owned by these huge, amorphous organizations. Ultimately, downstream, and the employee owns a few $100s or a few $1,000 of shares.
Well, I just don't understand. So this is like a natural disaster. And why does anybody deserve to get wiped out? Wouldn't that be immoral in and of itself?
No, because what's happening right now is what I'll tell you is on Main Street today, people are getting wiped out. And right now, rich CEOs are not. Boards that had horrible governance are not. Hedge funds are not. People are. And what we've done is disproportionately prop up and protect poor performing CEOs, companies, and boards. And you have to wash these people out.
What I'm hearing there, what I see in the guy's face, the journalist who's completely beside himself and can't fathom that someone would come on his airwaves and say such blasphemous things, is there's an assumption that, again, before the crisis, everything was fine. So this is a natural disaster, he claims. And it brings me to our conversation that you did with existentialism. There's an absurdity. There's a constant absurdity that exists when you're born, let's say, in a social and political and economic condition where your everyday life is a challenge. And he's unfamiliar with that absurdity in the norm a year ago, 2 years ago. And so here he's just completely shocked that we could say that anyone should be harmed. Well, people are harmed all of the time, and those people are especially harmed in this moment, It's I don't know.
And even if, let's say, the government was to give money to everybody right now, right? Including the hedge funds and all this stuff, this moment is increasing inequality. And outside of poverty, the discussion around poverty, like even without abject poverty, where everybody's fed and everybody's housed and whatever, inequality is a threat to a society in and of itself. Like inequality is the highest correlating factor across societies with violence, for example, with crime. It's not poverty, it's not abject poverty necessarily, it's inequality. It has a psychic effect on us when we live in a world where we see these people with incredible amounts of wealth showing it off, flaunting it in our faces, and we don't have access to it. It has a psychic effect on people, and it makes life unhealthy in a lot of ways. And so it's something to fight against in and of itself. And but I also I have another I think it's unbelievably valuable to have my fellow Ottawan, Chamath, out there, throwing down this truth and kind of being like an infiltrator in some ways, because this is somebody who grew up poor, grew up on welfare, with a family, immigrant family. He was born in Sri Lanka and grew up in Ottawa, and his family hit rough times, and he's got a lot of stories about that, and so he brings that sensibility. But it's also, he has his own incentives for the positions that he's taking as well, which I really appreciate him coming out and informing from the inside about how these things work and what's happening. But if you look at where he has his money, he has about $3 billion net worth, I think. And his money is in Amazon, Slack, which is a workplace organization thing, which is becoming every day more valuable right now as people are working remotely. Bitcoin, which people are saying this moment might actually lead to a resurgence in Bitcoin. And he was an early buyer of Bitcoin. And Virgin Galactic, which is basically, my understanding is for the ultra wealthy to go to space for a bit.
Right.
Is that a way of describing it?
I've heard.
He actually talks about how this moment is going to be a great moment for people to reflect on what they really want to do with their life. And he thinks that a lot of people are going to remember when they were kids and they wanted to be an astronaut, and they're going to come out of this pandemic and they're just going to they're gonna buy a ticket on Virgin Galactic and go visit space. So Billy, this is another side of Chamath that I saw on a podcast called The Pomp Podcast. And yes, Mr. Pomp begins every podcast with the words, bang, bang.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Chamath here with me. You need no introduction.
I have always wanted to be the best at something. I just didn't know what that was. And I wanted to push myself to try to be the best. And right now I'm in a lucky position where, this is the moment, I think, for me, where I can take, a $3-4 billion balance sheet and 10x it. It's not the money. It's proving how good I could be in these moments where I need to be clear-minded. And I can say, okay, I can make a couple billion-dollar bets here and try to 10x it. And in doing so, I can be part of the solution. I could hire lots of people. I could, solve really important problems that I've always wanted to solve. We're looking in healthcare. We're looking at climate change. We're looking at education. And those are the three areas that we think are going to change the fastest in this move to resiliency.
If I have to have billionaires, he's my favorite so far. I would like my billionaires like Chamath and Elon Musk and people who are out there valuing themselves based on what problems they solve, and are trying not to do harm and have kept in touch with their working class roots in some ways and have some sort of sensitivity to how their activities impact the poor. At the same time, he's trying to 10x, as he calls it, or multiply by 10 his wealth in this moment through investments in education, healthcare, and climate change. And I can't help but think that at some point in the future, like, what's his real, these two motivations are going to come into conflict. Is his motivation to 10 times his net worth so that he can prove to himself that he's a clear thinker under crisis? And does he really value himself on whether or not he can 10 times his $3 billion net worth? Because if that's the case, that's probably going to come into conflict with his goal of making education better for everybody or making healthcare better for everybody. Because it's pretty proven, for example, that private healthcare systems don't work very well for everybody. So how is he going to be like increasing his wealth? Maybe I guess it's probably through innovation. That's more his thing. He'll innovate, he'll create things. But you innovate something, you create it. I mean, if you invest a ton of money in the R&D, the research and development to make that thing, well, you're not going to 10x your wealth if you release it free to everybody in Africa, for example. So these two things are clearly going to come into conflict. And I'm a little scared that this guy, values himself by that number next to his name.
It'll have to be adding to the pot. It'll have to be the idea of innovation, that something happens and there's a breakthrough where that value weighed against whatever he extracts for his own personal wealth would be of greater service to the world. I think that's where he would have to come out from it. Other than that, it's a really clever rationalization, right? It would be a really clever, cute marketing rationalization if we wanted to see him in a more sinister light or a more, a more market-driven, image-centric light. You can say that. But I'd say if he's more genuinely interested in improving the world, then he believes that he'd make a bet that would improve those industries and improve the people who receive healthcare and education.
Yeah, I mean, it comes into a conflict with a bit of something I've been thinking about, thinking a lot about the situation of paying rent and paying mortgages in this moment. And because I talk to a lot of people, I talk to people in my building, and it seems like everybody has a different idea of fairness in this moment, and it's really hard to come to an agreement on what it would look like. But I feel like one thing that most of us could agree on is that in this moment, profit seeking isn't particularly ethical. Like, this maybe isn't the moment for you to be thinking about, like, how can I make the most money? Because, I mean, the most money you could make in this moment is probably by hoarding things that people need and jacking up the price, for example, and things like this. So I don't think the profit motive on its own is really helpful in this moment. I would be interested to see what like a moratorium on profits would look like. So for example, at the level of landlords, it would require some radical transparency. You know, like we would all find out, okay, what are my landlord's actual costs? You know, what percentage of my rent is pure profit for them, and what percentage is not? And I think this could be an interesting one. And to have like a people's audit. We're all sitting at home, or not. A lot of us are just sitting at home doing nothing. How interesting would it be to be able to go over like everywhere you spend your money, and seeing, you know, what percentage of that is costs, what percentage of that is profits, and having like a radical transparency in this moment.
Yeah, I love transparency, and I love the idea of a stoppage of profit for a while we're all recovering. But I just that the audit concept would be a requirement, and I just wonder how that blows over. I think we all know it wouldn't blow over fairly well. Private release of private expenses and debts and costs and that kind of like at the whim of people who they regard as they do in the in that, what's that called again, that the Landlord podcast, you know what I mean? Like, here, check this out. After, you know, they wouldn't approach it that way. So I mean, the resistance would be incredible, of course.
But then the question is, you know, so if Chamath, like for example, Slack, which he was one of the main early investors in, is a tool that is allowing a lot of people to continue working from home right now.
Yeah.
And to not be either without work or having to go to an office and exposed to this virus and things like this. So like that, in that case, there was like an innovation that made us more resilient in this moment and able to adapt. And I'm sure somebody who's like a more of a bigger fan of capitalism than I, for example, would say like that's a result of capitalism. But I feel like we can come up with something, with a system that can motivate those kinds of innovations without it being so tied to a system which just creates gross inequalities and empowers some of the most psychopathic people who are just thinking about themselves and their greed.
But that's why I think some kind of a reset is so necessary, because what Chamath is talking about, and I think what you're talking about, is like the next, if we're taking this moment seriously, we're going to all understand that the next growth sector is this resilient sector, sector of resiliency. Resiliency to what, right? Lots of things. There's a biological, there's environmental crises coming up next, or that we're currently in, and it's gradually becoming more and more urgent.
I mean, I think this is a good place to close. Like, what would, just to be thinking about resiliency at the level of our society, at the level of our community, the level of our building, and ourselves. You know, like I think a lot of people have been thinking about what their like zombie apocalypse like crew would look like who they would want with them and what skills they would want.
I've done that.
And you know, I've been thinking about like, okay, what are the skills I have that don't require regularly charging batteries? You know, like regularly charge, like, you know, like most of my skills are very digital, very video, very documenting what's happening, and I just don't know if somebody's gonna want to make room for me in the lifeboat, especially if I have all these like lithium batteries that are like taking up space that could be, you know, could have rice instead of rice. You know, I don't.
Jesse, you've got skills, man. You've got skills. You're a calming presence, bro. You're very rational. You're funny. You know what I mean? I remember you had...
Try making that argument in a tense situation, though. You have to take me. I'm rational and calm. Like, you know, it's like, I don't know.
Well, the rational calm guy wouldn't scream like that, but yeah, or maybe he would. I don't know if it's like that serious.
I don't know. It could be a test if the boat's leaving, and so far it doesn't look like I'm going to be invited onto it. I don't know.
Bro, you're in my zombie group. Just FYI.
Thank you, Billy.
I don't know if I'm in yours.
We're gonna go down.
The problem is,
you know what? I'll take whoever will take me right now, and we'll just die together.
Yeah. The problem is we have some overlapping skills, and we're already questioning whether those skills are good in this moment. So it's like shit. Two kind of iffy people.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get to work. I'm gonna start whittling. I'm gonna start making things.
Whittling. I haven't heard that in a while. Yeah. What would be the first thing you'd whittle? This is a test, Jesse. No pressure.
I'm trying actually. I guess like a tripod.
Oh my god, the worst answer.
I'm kidding.
I know you're kidding, but I mean that's the worst answer. That's so funny.
A knife, because my landlord hasn't given me one.
Exactly.
That's it. Episode 2.
This is fun, man.
In the books.
Another one. I appreciate it. This is dope. The next one, we wanted to focus on a person, right? Going through different phases. A person. So Dave Chappelle is my pick. I'm excited. Dave Chappelle, one of the best comedians ever. I might say the best comedian. The GOAT, still alive, living legend. And there's a lot to say about him, both positive and negative, or there's a critical thing. We can look at a lot of stuff over so many years of a pretty deep career, of a really intriguing and layered and interesting and hilarious man, and I can't wait to get into that.
I agree with that. I don't agree with the GOAT thing, but I definitely agree with. Yeah, we'll get into that. But
who's the GOAT?
Definitely.
Who's the GOAT?
It's such a crazy discussion. But I definitely like have a large part of my heart is like George Carlin.
Okay.
When I think about like a comedian who like both had big impacts on me, and they both opened my eyes to a lot of things. They both made me die laughing and like see a lot of things in a new way and open my mind. They did a lot of things that great comedians do, for sure. And I also love some of the new view, like Hassan Minhaj for me is, with a totally different style. That Homecoming special, Homecoming King. Anyways,
I didn't see
we got a lot to get into on this comedian thing.
We'll get into that. Yeah.
But I think this is going to be a good moment for us to show what I think is going to be one of our strengths and one of the things that I hope will separate us from a lot of the voices that I'm hearing out there, which is, I think, one of the reasons I want to do this with you, and is that we both, I believe, have this ability or willingness to both celebrate and criticize at the same time and find those nuances. And I think Dave Chappelle is going to be an opportunity for us to do that.
I think so too. I'm excited for it. Jesse, thank you again.
So hit all the buttons, like, subscribe, 5 stars, all that good stuff. All right, man. Much love.
Peace.